John Smith was the only Protestant to move into a large Catholic neighborhood. First Friday of Lent rolled around, and there was John out in his front yards grilling up a big old juicy steak. Meanwhile, all of his Catholic neighbors were inside, and they were eating their supper of cold tuna fish. And this went on Friday after Friday throughout Lent until finally on the last Friday of Lent, all the neighborhood men, they got together and they decided they just couldn't take it anymore. They had to do something about old Protestant John. I mean, he was tempting them to eat meat every Friday. So they decided they would have a talk with the guy. And they would try to convert him over to Catholicism. They went over and had the talk. It went pretty well, and John decided to convert. So they took him to Mass, and the priest came out and sprinkled him with some water and said, "You were born a Protestant, and you were raised a Protestant, but now you're a Catholic." But everybody was relieved. I mean, their biggest temptation was resolved. Next year's Lenten season, it rolled around, and with it the first Friday of Lent. And just around supper time in the neighborhood, everybody was sitting down to a sumptuous cold meal of tuna fish when there came the wafting smell of steak cooking on the grill. The neighborhood men could not believe their noses. What was going on here? So they all congregated in John's yard to see if he had forgotten about that first Friday thing of Lent. In fact, they arrived just in time to see John as he stood over his grill. He had a little pitcher of water. Occasionally he would sprinkle some of that water over the steak, and he was chanting, "You were born a cow, and you were raised a cow, but now you're a fish." Traditions are funny things, aren't they? For instance, do you ever wonder, how the Catholics got this whole eating fish on Friday thing going? Well, it seems that one of the theories is that the word Friday comes from the Roman goddess of fertility, Freya. And it seems the symbol of the fish was her sacred symbol. Why a fish, you might ask? Well, apparently it's because fish can contain up to around 10 million eggs. So you can begin to see how Freya's fertile Friday became connected with this being her sacred day. The fish was her sacred symbol. It seems more than just a mere coincidence to that this very day Catholics are taught that Friday is a day of abstinence from eating meat. That's the day you eat fish. After all, a lot of such ancient traditions and practices, they were Christianized by the Roman Catholic Church. It doesn't just have to be, things that came from centuries ago that become traditions for us. Let's take the Catholic Church. It was up in upstate New York. Just like our church, they had the same priest for 35 years. And like Pastor Dan, he was much beloved. And when he retired, a young priest just out of seminary came in and took over for him. And after several weeks, he perceived that the congregation was upset with him. So he pulled aside one of his lay leaders, and he said, "I don't know what's wrong, but I get the distinct impression that folks are upset with me." And the man said, "Well, Father, you're right. I hate to say it, but it's the way you're doing communion." "The way I'm doing communion," he said. "Well, it's not so much what you do, it's what you don't do," said the layman. "I don't think I leave anything out," said the young priest. "Oh, yes, you do," said the layman. "Just before our old priest administered the wine, he'd always go over first and he would touch the radiator." Touch The radiator. I never heard of that liturgical tradition, said the priest. So he got on the phone with his old retired predecessor and he said, I haven't even been here a month and already I'm in trouble. In trouble? Why? Asked the old priest. Well, it's got something to do with communion and touching the radiator. Did you do that? Well, yes, I did, said his predecessor. Always before I administered the chalice to the people, I touched the radiator to discharge the static electricity so no one would get shocked. So for 35 years, these people thought that touching the radiator was part of Holy Communion. Now, you folks wouldn't happen to have any such traditions in your 35 years with Pastor Dan that I should know about, do you? You know, we Protestants, we aren't any better than the Catholics when it comes to our traditions. Maybe you've heard this one. How many Protestants does it take to change a light bulb? And of course, the right answer is change! Change! Why, my grandfather donated that light bulb. Folks, in our gospel lesson for today, the Pharisees one day, they saw Jesus' disciples, and there they were eating without washing their hands. And it wasn't so much a question, as we heard, of hygiene as it was of tradition. The Jews, let's recall, had a ritual for washing hands as well as the washing of cups and pitchers and kettles and Chinese woks and microwavable dishware and George Foreman grills and just about anything else that you can think of. Cleanliness for them was next to godliness. And there was this thing called the Mishnah. It was a compilation of Jewish oral laws that was put together around the end of the 2nd century A.D. And it says that tradition is a fence around the law. Tradition, as the Jews saw it, protected God's holy word, and it assisted God's people in being able to carry it out. And I suppose this whole fencing of the law thing, it all began with good intentions. But as the years passed by, it began to result in some pretty amazing absurdities. For instance, looking in the mirror was forbidden on the Sabbath. Why? Because you might look in the mirror and see that you had a gray hair, and then you'd be tempted to pluck it out, and that would be work. You couldn't wear false teeth on the Sabbath, because if they fell out on the ground and you picked them up, that would be, you guessed it, working on the Sabbath. Then there's all kinds of laws that had to do with carrying a burden. You couldn't carry a handkerchief on the Sabbath, but you could wear one. And that meant if you were upstairs and you wanted to take it downstairs, then you would have to take the handkerchief downstairs by tying it onto your neck, walking downstairs, then taking it off, and then you could blow your nose. It was the same with the woman's hair clip. It depended on whether you were wearing it or whether you were carrying it. If you were wearing it, that was okay. But if you were carrying it, that was a burden. And so it was verboten on the Sabbath. And the same woman, she could go out into her courtyard on the Sabbath wearing a wig, and that was fine. But she couldn't wear that same wig out in the public. I mean, it got so ridiculous that rabbis, they even debated over whether a man with a wooden leg, if his house caught on fire, could carry his own leg out of a burning house on the Sabbath. Imagine that kind of stuff. The point is, it seems Jesus' disciples, they were neglecting these traditions. So the religious leaders, they asked Jesus the question that we heard in our lesson for today. Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but they eat with defiled hands? And Jesus, his reply back to them, it sounds just a bit harsh. Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, "This people, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God, and you hold to human tradition." Yeah, it may seem that Jesus was a practicing Jew, and yet at the same time, he didn't want his disciples to be slaves to tradition. And why not? Well, let's recall what a powerful thing tradition is in our lives. Not just religiously, but societally. We all have our family traditions. Think about your own. Let's take the woman who one day was baking a banana loaf, and the loaf was in the oven just as her 16-year-old son walked through the kitchen, and he said, "You know, Mom, that bread smells just about done. Don't you think you ought to take it out?" And just then, 18-year-old sister walked through as well. And she said, "Eddie, Mom's been burning that banana bread for 20 years now. I think she knows when to take it out." It seems Mom's burned banana bread had become a tradition. How about the 4 generations of women from the same family? The youngest, the now newly married great-granddaughter, asked her 40-something mom, Hey, Mom, why do we always cut the ham in half before we put it in the oven?" And Mom said, "I don't really know. Let's go and ask Grandma." Grandma was about 70, so they called her up on the phone, and they asked her, and she said, "I don't really know either. Let's call Great-Grandma." So they called up 90-year-old Great-Grandma, and what did she say? She said, "Well, it seems to me, if memory serves me right, when I was a little girl back during the Depression, that our oven was so small that we had no choice but to cut the ham in half just to get the dang thing in the oven." Yeah, we sometimes may not even know how or why certain traditions get started. And yet it plays such a significant role in our lives. It shows up in practically everything that we do. Let's take the role that tradition played in the design of our transportation system. Specifically, how far apart are the railroad lines in our country? Okay? They are exactly 4 feet, 8.5 inches. But where did that get started? Well, guess what? It started in our country of origin. We as America sprang from England. It came from England. So over in England, the rail lines, they were 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart. Okay, but where did that come from? Well, before the rail lines were there were tram lines. And the tramway lines were 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Okay, but where did that come from? Well, before the tramway lines, there were people driving around in wagons, and they would make ruts in the road. And the ruts in the road were exactly 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. Okay, preacher, but why were they 4 feet, 8.5 inches? Well, guess who the builders of the roads were? Way back when, it was the Romans. And they built those roads for their Roman legions. And the ruts, they were made by their chariots. And everyone else had to match those ruts for fear of destroying their own wagon wheels. And since the chariots were made by the Roman Empire, you can pretty well bet that they were all a standardized wheel spacing. Thus, we have the answer to our original question. The distance of 4 feet, 8.5 inches derives from the specification of a Roman war chariot. Okay, Pastor, but still, why 4 feet, 8.5 inches? Well, it seems the chariots were made just wide enough to accommodate the behinds of 2 war horses. That's the ultimate answer to the question of why our railway lines are 4 feet, 8.5 inches, the sizes of the behinds of 2 war horses from Rome. But then wait, there's even more. How many of you have ever seen a shuttle, okay, a space shuttle, sitting out on the launch pad on TV waiting to be launched? Well, if you've ever noticed, there's these 2 big boosters attached to the sides of the main fuel tanks, and they are called SRBs. And though the engineers would have liked to have designed them bigger, they couldn't, because the SRBs had to be shipped from the factory where they were made in Utah clear to the launch pad in Florida. And along the way as well, during transport, they had to go through all of these tunnels and mountains in which the tunnels were barely wider than the railway tracks. So think about that for a minute. Folks, the major design feature of what is arguably the world's most advanced transportation system, the space shuttle, is still determined by the width of 2 horses' behinds. Traditions, they're important. They deeply impact our daily lives. And even more, they give us a sense of our identity. And as a result, tradition plays out according to our culture. Even traditions come according to the region of the country you are from. When I pastored over in Akron, Ohio, you know that little strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street? They call that there the Devil's Strip. Peculiar only to Akron, Ohio. All the people from West Virginia, they moved up to work in the rubber mills and factories, and they were working often, multiple shifts, and their kids were home alone, and they were afraid their kids would get out in the street, so they told them this story about the Devil's Strip. If you go past that strip, the devil's going to get you. It became part of the identity of Akron, Ohio. Or how about what a preacher by the name of Carson Hughes has to say? He says, down where I pastor, folks in Charleston, South Carolina, pay more attention to tradition than any other place I've ever been. In fact, they pay particular attention to how long your family has lived in Charleston. Seems the general assumption is that a family cannot claim to be native Charlestonians until they have lived there for at least 3 generations. And that means being born in Charleston and remaining in Charleston until death do you part. Let's take, for instance, a dinner party where I met a man whose accent was definitely that of a Charlestonian. I asked him if he was a native, and with a sad expression on his face, the man said, "No, I'm not a native Charlestonian. I've lived here all my life. My father and my mother were born and raised here all of their lives. And the same is true of both sets of my grandparents, their parents, and their great-grandparents. But I will never be considered a native Charlestonian." And I wondered why. After all, it certainly sounded like his family had the prerequisite 3 generations, to which he responded, "You see, I was born during World War II. My father was overseas, so my mother, she visited relatives in Greenwood, South Carolina, and by chance, I was prematurely born there." So this guy could never be a real Charlestonian, Hughes writes, even though his family had been there for generations, because due to a quirk of fate, he was born elsewhere. And he said all of this at a dinner party, as if he were confessing to me his greatest sin. And when he finished, I was tempted to say, "God be with you. Go and sin no more." Poor fella. Think about how difficult that is. And yet tradition, it does give us a sense of our identity. For the Jews, this was always important, because the Jews, they viewed themselves as God's set-apart people. They were holy unto themselves. And the traditions that they followed had always helped them maintain their unique identity. Remember Tevye from the musical Fiddler on the Roof? He was the dad. And, of course, the big song in Fiddler on the Roof, of course, is the song Tradition. But remember what he had to say about tradition? He says, "You may ask me why we practice these traditions. Well, I'll tell you. I don't know. They're just traditions." And for the Jews, considering all of the persecutions they went through over the generations, it's doubtful that they would have made it through without their traditions. Tradition held them together. And yet, as our gospel lesson reminds us today, traditions can also get out of hand. They can become an idol, a substitute for God. Traditions, they may tell us what was appropriate for our ancestors here at the Community Church of Douglas 50 years ago when everything got started, but they may not always be a reliable indicator of how we should live today. After all, wasn't Jesus always saying, "You've heard it said of old, but I say unto you"? Yeah, tradition is one guide for our behavior, but only one. Times change and situations change, but far more important is the Spirit of the living God moving in our midst and guiding us in our present situation. I mean, suppose we had a tradition in our church that only people who dressed in a certain way would be acceptable in our services. And let's say that men, you were only allowed to wear suits. Well, on the surface, we might be able to justify that. After all, we believe that the worship of God deserves our very best, so we should wear our very best in worship. That sounds like a reasonable tradition, doesn't it? But is that where God would lead us today? Let's take the man who showed up to worship one day in a church, and he was dressed in rags, and he smelled to high heaven. So the people in the church just tried to ignore him, and the usher seated him over in the back by a window so hopefully the smell would dissipate. But the next Sunday, he showed up again, but this time he was wearing an expensive suit, and by his appearance, the usher immediately recognized that he was a man of importance, and so he brought him up front and seated him in a place of prime importance. And when the service was over, the pastor and his wife invited the man home for Sunday dinner. And when they brought him home, they treated him like a king. And when dinner time came and they sat down to eat and they passed around the meat, something peculiar happened. The man took the platter, he took a portion of the meat, and he proceeded to stick it in his suit jacket pocket. And then when the potatoes came around, he put those in his vest pocket. And when the gravy came around, he poured that into his other pocket. And finally, the preacher couldn't stand it anymore, and so he said, "Hey, what gives? Why are you doing this?" "Well," said the visitor, "you obviously didn't invite me to dinner. You invited my suit. So I'm feeding my suit." Ridiculous, isn't it? But so is our tendency to elevate our traditions over Christ's love for those that He came to save. Yeah, Jesus said that His main mission was to seek and to save the lost, not to follow a bunch of rituals and traditions that had become idols, even to the point that no one could even remember how they had got started in the first place. Yeah, He of all people, He cared about the law. After all, Jesus said, "I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." And Jesus made it clear that until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, which was the smallest Hebrew letter, And not one single little tittle, which was the least stroke of a pen, will pass away from the law until all of God's purposes are accomplished. Yeah, Jesus honored the law and its traditions, but he also knew that God's laws were created to protect and to provide for us. The Sabbath was not made for us, but rather we for the Sabbath, which is to say, sometimes, unfortunately, we religious folks, we can get the means and the ends all mixed up. Sometimes we forget why we're here and what we're supposed to be about. We get all caught up in fulfilling our weekly and daily rituals that we overlook. A hurting and hungering and grieving world. And that's why if it were our tradition to have only people at our church here who are of a certain race or a certain theology or a certain dress code, couldn't you see that there might come that time when God would say to us that it was time for us to move out of our comfort zones and our traditions and to accept people that we previously maybe had shut out? Yeah. If we're going to be doing what Jesus has called us to do, it might be just necessary to change that light bulb. Change? Why, my granddaddy donated that light bulb. And yet if changing that light bulb would result in being able to reach more people for Christ, would we be willing to do it? Folks, the Pharisees were deeply religious folk, just like us. But they had begun to substitute their traditions for God. Their traditions told them who was acceptable and who was not. In fact, even if God Himself had come to them and tried to change their traditions, they wouldn't listen. After all, they nailed God to a tree. I wonder, could we get so caught up in our traditions that even if Jesus were to come to us, that the same thing could happen here? Let's pray. Lord, as your people, it is our desire that nothing become an idol, that nothing would ever stand in the way of we being your people and we being able to effectively serve you by leading others to you. Have thine own way, Lord, whatever it takes, so that we might reach others for Christ. Let us be that kind of people here at the Community Church of Douglas. For this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.